There's a moment that doesn't announce itself loudly. No dramatic shift, no sudden realization that everything has changed overnight. It's quieter than that. You catch your reflection one day, maybe in a mirror you've passed 1,000 times, and something feels different. Not in a way you can easily explain. Your face is the same. Your features haven't changed, but your eyes hold something new. Or maybe it's not new at all. Maybe it's something that was always there, finally becoming visible. And what's strange is, it's not just about how they look. It's how they feel. It's how you see. And more importantly, how you understand. This isn't about anything mystical or supernatural. It's something far more grounded and in many ways far more meaningful. Because when your eyes begin to change, what's really happening is that your awareness is evolving in a way that can't be undone. You're not becoming someone else. You're finally seeing as yourself. At some point in your life, you started noticing that you don't experience things the way you used to. Situations that once overwhelmed you now feel manageable. Conversations that used to excite you might now feel draining or surface level. Even the way you react to people has shifted. You pause more. You observe more. You respond instead of react. And sometimes that creates distance. Not because you think you're better than anyone, but because your internal world has become more complex, more layered, more aware. You might have felt misunderstood during this phase, maybe even disconnected. It's not loneliness in the traditional sense. You can be around people and still feel like you're processing life on a completely different frequency. That's where the change begins. Not in your environment, but in your perception of it. When observation replaces reaction. There was a time when everything felt immediate. Someone said something and you reacted instantly. Something went wrong and your emotions followed without hesitation. Life felt like a constant chain of reactions, one after another. But now there's space, a pause that didn't exist before. You notice things before responding. You watch people more closely, not in a judgmental way, but in a curious, almost analytical way. You start picking up on tone, body language, subtle inconsistencies. And this shift can feel unfamiliar at first. Because reacting is easy, observing requires presence. Psychologically, this is what happens when your awareness expands beyond impulse. Your brain starts engaging higher level processing instead of default emotional responses. You begin to separate what's happening from how you choose to engage with it. This is where your eyes start to change. Because you're no longer just looking, you're seeing. And once you start seeing clearly, it becomes harder to go back to reacting blindly. The quiet shift in what holds your attention. You begin to notice that the things that used to capture your interest don't hit the same way anymore. It's not that they're bad. They just feel incomplete. Conversations that revolve around gossip, comparison, or surface-level topics start to feel draining instead of entertaining. You find yourself craving depth, not necessarily serious or heavy conversations, but something real, something honest. And at the same time, your attention shifts inward. You start thinking more, reflecting more, questioning patterns, behaviors, even your own decisions. You replay moments, not to criticize yourself, but to understand. This internal shift is subtle but powerful, because attention shapes experience. When your attention changes, your entire reality begins to reorganize around it. This is why your eyes feel different, because you're not drawn to the same things anymore. And that changes what you see. Emotional detachment that isn't coldness. One of the most misunderstood parts of this phase is the emotional shift. You might feel less reactive, less easily triggered. Situations that once would have pulled you in emotionally now feel more distant. And this can be confusing. You might wonder if you're becoming numb. But you're not. You're becoming selective. There's a difference between shutting down emotionally and choosing where your energy goes. What you're experiencing is a form of emotional regulation. Your mind learning that not everything deserves the same level of emotional investment. You still feel deeply, but you don't feel everything. And that distinction is important because it allows you to protect your focus, your peace, and your clarity. This is another way your eyes change. You stop seeing everything as equally important, and you start recognizing what truly matters, seeing patterns you once missed. There's a moment in personal growth where things start connecting. You notice patterns in people's behavior. You recognize cycles in your own life. You begin to understand why certain situations repeat themselves, not as random events, but as outcomes of choices, habits, and perspectives. This awareness can feel overwhelming at first, because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. You might notice how certain conversations follow predictable paths, how certain relationships operate on unspoken dynamics, how certain environments influence behavior more than you realized. And most importantly, you start seeing your role in all of it, not in a self-blaming way, but in a responsible way. This is where growth becomes real, because awareness creates choice, and choice creates change. Your eyes aren't just observing anymore. They're interpreting, the internal realignment of identity. At some point, the changes stop feeling external, and they start becoming internal. You begin to question who you are, not in an unstable way, but in a curious, reflective way. You revisit your beliefs, your preferences, your goals. Things that once felt certain now feel open to exploration. This can feel uncomfortable because identity provides stability. And when that identity starts shifting, it can feel like you're losing something. But what's actually happening is refinement. You're letting go of versions of yourself that were shaped by circumstance, expectation, or past experiences, and moving towards something more intentional. This is not a sudden transformation. It's gradual, quiet, sometimes even invisible to others. But you feel it in the way you think, in the way you choose, in the way you carry yourself. This is where the change in your eyes becomes most noticeable, because your sense of self is no longer borrowed. It's becoming built, the stillness that replaces the noise. There's a kind of silence that starts to emerge during this phase, not the absence of sound, but the absence of internal noise. You're no longer constantly overthinking every detail. You don't feel the same urgency to prove, explain, or justify yourself. There's a calmness that settles in, not because everything is perfect, but because you've learned how to navigate imperfection. This stillness is powerful because it creates clarity, and clarity changes everything. You start making decisions that align with your long-term well-being instead of short-term emotion. You become more intentional with your time, your energy, and your attention. And this doesn't make life easier, but it makes it more aligned. Your eyes in this phase reflect something different. Not intensity, not confusion, but steadiness. The subtle confidence that doesn't need to be seen. Toward the later stages of this process, something shifts again. But this time, it's not about awareness. It's about presence. You begin to feel more grounded in who you are, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet, stable way that doesn't require validation. You don't feel the need to convince others of your perspective. You don't feel pulled into every disagreement. You don't feel defined by every outcome. There's a sense of internal security that develops. And it shows, not through words, but through energy, through posture, through the way you engage or choose not to engage. This is where the mystery people might notice comes from. It's not something you're trying to project. It's something that naturally emerges when you become more aligned with yourself. Your eyes don't just look different, they feel different because they're no longer searching, they're understanding. By the time you reach this point, you realize something important. Nothing about this process was random. It wasn't about becoming someone extraordinary. It was about becoming more aware, more intentional, and more aligned with your own experience. The changes you noticed, the way you see, the way you feel, the way you process, are all reflections of that internal shift. And while it might feel isolating at times, it's also deeply grounding because you're no longer navigating life on autopilot. You're choosing, you're understanding, you're present, and maybe that's what people sense when they say your eyes have changed. Not something mystical, not something dramatic, just something real. The interesting part is, the more you settle into this shift, the less you feel the need to explain it. At the beginning, there's often an urge to put it into words, to describe what's changing, to make sense of it out loud to see if others relate. But over time, that urge softens. Not because it's less important, but because it becomes more natural. You stop needing confirmation for something you can already feel within yourself. And that's where another layer of this transformation begins to unfold. When you stop forcing clarity, earlier in your life, uncertainty probably felt uncomfortable. You wanted answers quickly. You wanted things to make sense right away. If something felt unclear, you'd either overthink it or try to resolve it as fast as possible. Now, there's a different relationship with not knowing. You can sit with it. You can experience a situation without immediately labeling it, solving it, or defining it. And surprisingly, that patience often leads to deeper clarity than rushing ever did. This is a psychological shift toward tolerance of ambiguity, a sign of maturity in how the mind processes complexity. Instead of needing immediate resolution, your mind allows information to unfold over time. And this directly affects how you see the world. Because when you stop forcing clarity, you start noticing details that were previously overlooked. Your eyes don't rush anymore. They take in, they process, they understand at their own pace. The way you experience time changes. It's subtle, but it's there. Time doesn't feel the same as it used to. Moments feel more defined. Conversations feel more intentional. Even silence feels more noticeable, not awkward, just present. You're not constantly rushing to the next thing in the same way. There's more awareness of where you are, what you're doing, and how you're experiencing it. At the same time, you become more selective with how you spend your time. Things that drain you feel heavier than before. Things that align with you feel lighter, more engaging, more real. This shift isn't about productivity. It's about alignment. And when your sense of time changes, your priorities naturally follow. This is another way your perception evolves. Because you're no longer just moving through time. You're experiencing it, recognizing the difference between noise and meaning. There's a point where you begin to distinguish between what's loud and what's meaningful. Not everything that grabs attention deserves it. Not everything that feels urgent actually matters. This becomes especially clear in how you engage with information, conversations, and even your own thoughts. You start filtering more, not in a closed-off way, but in a focused way. You begin to ask yourself, even subconsciously, does this add anything to my understanding, or is it just filling space? And that question changes everything. Because once you recognize noise, you naturally start seeking meaning. This applies to relationships too. You value presence over performance, depth over distraction, authenticity over impression. And your eyes reflect that shift. They're not easily pulled in every direction anymore. They're steady, intentional, selective, the subtle grief of outgrowing old versions of yourself. One of the less talked about parts of growth is that it involves loss. Not dramatic loss, but quiet internal loss. You begin to outgrow certain habits, certain mindsets, even certain ways of relating to people. And while this is necessary, it can also feel strange. There's a kind of nostalgia that comes with it. You remember how you used to think, how you used to react, how certain things used to feel. And even if those versions of you were less aware, they were still familiar. Letting go of familiarity isn't always easy, even when it's healthy. This is where emotional complexity deepens. Because you're not just moving forward, you're also acknowledging what you're leaving behind. And that awareness adds depth to how you experience everything, including yourself. Your eyes in this phase carry both clarity and history. They reflect growth, but also understanding of what that growth required, becoming more honest with yourself. As awareness increases, so does honesty. Not the kind of honesty you present to others, but the kind you hold within yourself. You start recognizing your own patterns more clearly. Your strengths, yes, but also your blind spots, your habits, your tendencies, your defaults. And instead of avoiding them, you face them. Not harshly, not critically, but directly. This is where real change happens. Because growth isn't just about seeing the world differently, it's about seeing yourself accurately. And that requires a level of self-awareness that isn't always comfortable. But it's necessary, because once you see yourself clearly, you can begin to adjust, refine, and evolve in a way that's actually aligned with who you want to become. Your perception becomes more balanced, less reactive, more grounded. And again, this shows, not through anything dramatic, but through consistency, the shift from external validation to internal stability. There was a time when feedback from others carried a lot of weight. Approval felt important, recognition felt necessary. Even small reactions could influence how you felt about yourself. But over time, that dynamic changes. You still appreciate feedback, but you're no longer dependent on it. Your sense of self becomes more internally anchored. You begin to evaluate yourself based on your own standards, your own growth, your own intentions. And this creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, but stable. It doesn't fluctuate with every external opinion. It stays. This is one of the most noticeable internal shifts. Because when your validation comes from within, your interactions with the outside world become more balanced. You're open but not dependent, engaged but not controlled. Your eyes reflect that balance. There's less searching, more certainty. The way you connect with others evolves. Relationships start to feel different. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. You become more aware of the dynamics within them. You notice how conversations flow, how energy is exchanged, how understanding is built, or sometimes not built at all. You might find yourself connecting more deeply with fewer people. Not by force, just naturally, because depth requires mutual awareness. And not everyone is operating from the same level of reflection or intention. This doesn't create distance out of judgment. It creates distance out of alignment. And at the same time, the connections that do align feel more meaningful than ever. More real, more grounded, more present. This is another layer of how your perception changes. Because you're no longer just interacting. You're connecting, living with awareness instead of escaping it. Earlier in life, it's easy to avoid awareness. Distractions are everywhere. It's simple to stay busy, to fill time, to move from one thing to another without really sitting with your own thoughts. But once your awareness deepens, escape becomes less appealing. Not because distractions disappear, but because they no longer satisfy in the same way. You become more comfortable sitting with your thoughts, your feelings, your observations, even the uncomfortable ones. And this changes your relationship with yourself. You're no longer trying to outrun your own mind. You're learning how to understand it. And that understanding creates stability. Because when you're not constantly avoiding yourself, you develop a stronger sense of presence. And presence changes everything. At this stage, the change you once noticed becomes something you live with naturally. It's no longer something you question. It's something you embody. Your awareness has expanded. Your perception has deepened. Your identity has become more intentional. And through all of that, something as simple as the way you look at the world and the way the world looks back at you has shifted. Not in a way that needs explanation, but in a way that can be felt. If you've been noticing these changes, even in small ways, it might help to take a moment and reflect on where you were before and where you are now. Not to measure progress in a strict way, but to recognize the subtle evolution that's been happening over time. Sometimes, the most meaningful changes are the ones that don't need to be announced. They just become part of how you see everything. As you reach this point, there's something worth sitting with for a moment. Not everything you've been experiencing needs to be labeled, explained, or turned into a conclusion right away. Sometimes, the real value is in simply noticing it, recognizing how your perspective has shifted, how your reactions have changed, how your understanding has deepened over time. So instead of rushing past this, take a second and think about your own journey. Where have you noticed yourself seeing things differently than before? What situations no longer affect you the same way? What have you quietly, without even realizing it at the time? If any part of this resonated with you, share your experience in your own words. Not to prove anything, but to reflect, to process, and maybe even help someone else who's going through a similar shift but hasn't been able to put it into words yet. And if this kind of perspective is something you want more of, real, grounded conversations about growth, awareness, and personal change, then stay connected in whatever way feels right to you. No pressure, no urgency. Just an open space to keep exploring, understanding, and evolving at your own pace.